slides set up, but thank you very much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ray Holt from the School of Mechanical Engineering, where I'm a lecturer in product design. And yeah, I've been doing work for the last sort of decade or so on particular kind of haptics and communication for deafblindness. I had the pleasure of starting working with Arthur Theil, then at Offenburg University on a Horizon 2020 project called Suitcase.
I don't need this, right? Or you can see my slides.
That's true.
Perfect.
That's true, actually, because what we can do, we can just put this up here. Yeah, we had the pleasure of meeting about 4.5 years ago now, but only met in person last year, thanks to COVID. Great fun. But Arthur's now based at Birmingham City University, where he's doing some work on accessible gaming and inclusive immersive technologies. So that's what he'll be presenting about today. We'll have some time for presentation, also some time to ask any questions that you have. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Arthur.
Thank you, Ray.
Take it away.
Can everybody see me, hear me okay, online and in person? Great. So yeah, Ray, thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this session. It's the second time actually I come to Leeds. It's always a good pleasure to travel up north and experience this very beautiful campus. So today I'll be talking about some of my I would say recent work around towards accessible gaming and inclusive immersive technologies. There has been a lot of current developments in the field, both through research but also through industry initiatives. But in this hour, I'll be focusing on the work we've been doing in our research group at BCU. So, all right. So the structure for today's session. So firstly, I'll start with the findings and my work in the Suitcase project that I was collaborating with Ray a few years ago. It was a European project funded by the Horizon 2020 program. And I would say my focus during the Suitcase project was actually understanding any accessibility problems, focus on deafblind players, and how to minimize these problems for this very specific community of players. Then I'll talk a little bit about our collaborative project with Facebook Meta, the Consider Everyone project that was finished in 2022, and the focus of this project was actually around understanding, identifying VR, AR accessibility barriers for disabled users. So we didn't focus on a specific group of disabled users. It was more a overview, a broad understanding of accessibility problems. And the idea was to collaborate with these communities and identify problems that should be addressed in the industry. And finally, I'll be finishing this session with some key results of our most recent work around accessible VR locomotion techniques, and I'll be presenting a summary of some results that were published this month. So you'll be the first one to actually hear these findings. So as Ray's introduced me, so I am a lecturer in human-computer interaction at Birmingham City University. I have been working there for 3 years now. I am part of the HCI research group. I also teach UX design and accessibility. Before that, I was a postdoc in Germany, where I was working in the Suitcase project. And the Suitcase project was actually, I think, the first big project that focused on designing inclusive technologies for deafblind people. If you are not familiar with the concept of deafblindness, is when people have the combination of both visual and hearing impairments. It's also called dual sensory loss. And the idea of the Suitcase project was to actually design different technologies to support deafblind people in navigating independently, communication, but also one of the focus was around using games and making games more accessible for this community. So why it's important to actually understand and think about accessible games for people who are deafblind? Well, currently there is an assumption that to play a game, you should be able to see or hear well, which is not the case for around 3 million people in Europe who are deafblind. So people who experience the combination of both of visual and hearing impairments. And actually, before the Suitcase project, there was little work around understanding the personal experiences of deafblind users and players, and what sort of accessibility challenges they face when they try to play games. And because games are so important for a lot of people, we decided to run and conduct a more exploratory research with this community. Right, so I think it's delayed. You see my next slide?
Like synced presenter, the mouse on the desktop.
Oh, it's good to know that. There you go. Right. So a little bit about how we, conducted this research with the deafblind community in Europe. So as part of the Suitcase project, we conducted 60 interviews with deafblind individuals in 5 European countries, including, the UK, Germany, Netherlands, Greece, and Sweden. And the idea was actually to interview people, not just because of, ask questions about games, but technology in general. But my work was actually just understanding the role of games in their lives and what sort of challenges they face when they play games. And this was actually the first work focusing on accessibility and challenges for people with multiple disabilities, for example, deafblindness. And the results of this paper were actually published a few years ago. I included the reference here if you are interested in looking into details, but I can also share the slides afterwards as well. So some key findings of these interviews, we run thematic analysis, and we found that actually from those 60 deafblind individuals that we interviewed, only 20% of participants actually played games regularly. And this is nothing new. We know that accessibility is actually a huge problem in terms of gaming. But one thing that was very interesting to understand, it was that 77% of the participants actually stopped playing games, at least one of their preferred games, because of their disability, because of deafblindness, which is a huge number that should be considered as well. We also found that casual mobile games were the preferred type of games among the people who we interviewed. And this makes sense because the more complex the game is, the more accessibility problems we find. So actually, the people we interviewed, the 20% who actually play games regularly, they much prefer casual mobile games just because of the simplicity of game dynamics, and also because a lot of these mobile games are much more accessible and include much more accessibility features because mobile games and mobile devices are more accessible than platform playing consoles as well. So if you look at, for example, Xbox, PlayStation, these are great platforms, but they are not as accessible as mobile devices because smartphones, iPhones, Androids, they have a number of inbuilt accessibility features that are very useful when people try to play games. So this was something very, very important that we found, that people prefer more simple games due to their very specific disability. And also, we found that actually playing games is a very important activity. It's not just for fun, but also a way, to meet other people, to occupy their time, and to stay social. It's very difficult for some deafblind individuals to actually find a inclusive hobby. So playing games is one way to do that. So one of the assumptions is that games are not that important, but for people who are deafblind, actually playing games is one of the most important activities. But in terms of actual, accessibility of current games and their interfaces, we also found other results. One of the main results actually for that people shared with us is that current games, regardless if they are casual, mobile, or more advanced, they lack the support of using multiple assistive devices simultaneously. Deafblind people usually they have to use multiple assistive technologies at the same time. For example, braille displays, hearing aids, voiceover, screen readers. Deafblind people usually have to use one or two assistive devices at the same time. However, this is not compatible with a lot of the games that are currently available in the market. So this was one of the most important considerations for us. The other finding is that actually for deafblind people who communicate through tactile ways, there is a lack of compatibility with refreshable braille displays. So refreshable braille displays are used for people who communicate with braille. They are very expensive. They are very robust. And actually, we found that a lot of these games, especially mobile games, they are not compatible with braille displays. And this is something that is very important for those who rely on these displays to access information. And finally, something that was very interesting to find is that there is a lack of support for mixed ability play with non-disabled players. So as I mentioned before, games are also a social activity. The problem is when you are deafblind and you want to play against someone else, there has to be a level of competitiveness, right? And a lot of people actually said that, well, yeah, the interface, the game itself is accessible. I can play it. But when I play against someone else, I need more time to complete the same action or the same turn, and people feel like I'm not a good competitor to play with. So one topic for future research is actually to understand how to improve multiplayer experiences for people who are deafblind, so they actually can play successfully against other players. So here in this slide, I show a summary of some of the accessibility barriers that we found that people share with us when we interview them. And this is the same for mobile or more complex gaming platforms, but the most common complaint was actually screen size. So when you think about deafblind players, there is an assumption that they are completely blind, but actually a lot of people rely on residual vision. But screen size is always a problem. So this was the most common complaint in terms of accessibility for playing games. But there are other very significant barriers that we identified. For example, there are no audio descriptions or captions for those who are maybe using a screen reader or a braille display to access information. In terms of multisensory processing, a lot of these games were deemed as too fast or have too many things going on at the same time, and this leads to a sensory overload, a cognitive overload for deafblind people. So this was also a complaint saying that actually the game dynamic was too complex for them, and they much prefer a more simple interaction. some time constraints, when you play games and you have a certain period of time to complete the action. This might become a problem for some deafblind players. So they also mentioned that as a potential accessibility barrier. So the inability to respond quickly, deafblind gamers might need more time to complete certain actions when they are playing games. Again, as I mentioned before, because deafblind people usually rely on multiple assistive devices at the same time, sometimes the game says, well, we are accessible, but actually they only support a limited set of devices at a time. So this was also a potential barrier for the people we interviewed. Subtle audio cues. If you play games, you see that actually a lot of these games, they use audio to inform players of different things going on. However, some of these cues are very subtle and very difficult to perceive if you have limited hearing. And again, a lot of people mentioned that lack of customization in terms of graphics, interface, audio output was also a problem, and these will be discussed later on when I present the results of the other projects that we have been working on. So the lack of customizable features is a significant accessibility problem that should be resolved. And finally, just to summarize, the main results, people complain that there is a limited access to information about other players if they are playing with other people, and language accessibility as well. Because we interview people across Europe with different native languages. Sometimes these games are only available in English, so he assumes that people are fluent in English, but actually that's not the case for some of the people we interviewed. So language can become a accessibility barrier as well. So just to summarize the conclusions and the takeaways from these research. So we found that even though the accessibility field is developing every day in terms of, making sure that games are more accessible, it's still a lot of, the game developers and designers, they assume that all disabled gamers fit in a very well-defined box. That's not the case for a lot of deafblind players that we interviewed. So we shouldn't assume that their experiences will be similar to people, for example, who are only blind or only deaf. So we need to consider all these individualities in terms of accessibility. Another thing that we found, and I think it's crucial to share this, is that there are a number of currently available accessible games. So there are a number of games that can be accessible for people who are deafblind. However, it's very difficult to find this information online because actually a lot of these websites, they are not accessible, and people cannot find the information about these initiatives. So it's really important to create awareness around the experiences of different gaming communities, especially people with multiple complex disabilities, to actually drive change in this field. So as a call to action to the research community, we identify a number of research areas that could be potentially explored in the near future to drive innovation in this field in terms of accessible games. One of the things is actually to explore the use of binaural audio and integrated audio descriptions for navigation, interaction, and environment description. A lot of these games actually, they do provide audio description for one of these things, but it's very difficult to actually find a game that is fully accessible in terms of describing navigation, interaction methods, but also the environment. So there's a lot of work to be done in this field. Also, based on the answers that we received in these interviews, there is a need for expanding the use of built-in accessibility features and support the use of multiple assistive devices simultaneously, including refreshable braille displays. So when game developers think about, using assistive technologies, they might want to consider that some players will be using multiple devices at the same time, and all of them should be supported. Otherwise, people won't be able to play the game. And again, this would be a recurrent topic in this presentation. There is a need for supporting more, higher levels of customization to avoid sensory and cognitive overload for disabled players. And finally, I think this is also one of my personal interests in terms of using haptics to support playing games and support accessibility. Not only for feedback, there has been a lot of development in terms of using haptics for games, but also for immersive technologies. But this is mostly used as a feedback mechanism to tell the users and the players what has been done. However, we can use haptics also as a feed-forward technique to guide gamers, but also teach them how to play a game as well. And there's a lot of research needed in this field as well. So following up, I mean, as I mentioned before, in the suitcase project, we found that actually deafblind players prefer simple games and simple interactions and simple experiences because they are deemed as more accessible. However, we know that in terms of games and immersive technologies, technology is developing every day, and these experiences are becoming more and more complex. So the more immersive and the more complex the technology or the environment is, more accessibility problems arise. So following up from the suitcase project, we started the Facebook Meta project that looked into understanding what are the current significant barriers for disabled users when they use VR and AR technologies, so immersive platforms across virtual and augmented reality. So the main goal of this project was actually to first identify barriers to participation and to engaging in these immersive platforms, and how to drive a change in the field. So to address these current gaps in the technology, we led a series of multidisciplinary workshops with relevant stakeholders to together explore, challenges, opportunities, but also potential solutions in the field. And how we did that, we run two workshops. So the first workshop had 22 participants representing users with lived experience of disability. We tried to recruit people with, a diverse range of abilities and impairments. We really wanted to hear a diversity of experiences and perspectives around VR accessibility, but we also invited industry professionals, people who are working in the VR industry, developers, researchers, and designers, and also academic researchers besides our own group. So the second workshop, we also had 32 participants representing a diverse group of users, developers, and also we invited relevant organizations, for example, charities working with disabled communities, but also specific needs colleges that might be interested, for example, in using VR for educational purposes. So we wanted to invite people with a diverse range of experiences with VR. And then together, as I mentioned before, we try to identify existing pressing challenges, not only with VR software, but also VR hardware, interaction techniques, and also some ethical considerations that I'll be sharing in a moment. And the results of these projects have been published last year in International Journal of Human-Computer Interaction. I included the reference here as well if you want to look at the results in more detail, but again, as I mentioned, I can share the slides after this session. So now I'm going to go through some of the main results from these workshops. Again, this is I'm only summarizing the main considerations across different aspects of VR experiences, but we did identify a number of other very important accessibility barriers as well. They are available in the paper. So in terms of software accessibility, we were able to identify together with these communities a number of pressing barriers that should be prioritized to drive change in this field. In terms of physical accessibility, we found that involuntary movements, for example, when people use VR headsets and controllers through their eye movements or limb movements, when they make involuntary movements, it might become a accessibility barrier, especially for people with physical impairments, because some of them cannot control these movements. So when making voluntary movements become a problem, it should be solved as well. This was the main challenge described during the workshops for people with physical impairments. In terms of cognitive accessibility, and also very important for people who are neurodiverse, many participants actually mentioned that sensory and cognitive overload it's a huge problem in terms of software accessibility for VR. Usually in the virtual environment, all this sensory information is displayed at once, and this can be can become overwhelming for some users. So again, the idea of trying to customize the experience might be very useful here. In terms of visual accessibility, as I mentioned from the results of the Suitcase project, so the lack of binaural audio is a current limitation in VR technology. So how can you use binaural audio to support and provide a very detailed audio description of an environment, the navigation systems, but also the interaction possibilities. And based on that, we also found another thing that it's very, very simple, but it's not accessible at times. It's about menus. So a lot of these VR applications, they have menus, and if you look at the menu, you can actually have you can find an accessibility option where people can customize their preferences in terms of accessibility. However, the menu itself is not accessible, so people are not able to actually activate and navigate the menu. So this is a huge problem that should be addressed as well. And finally, in terms of audio accessibility, as I mentioned before, a lot of these technologies, they use audio to describe what's going on screen, but there's a lack of clarity in how this is being provided, and also a lack of customizable preferences. For example, making sure that you can change the volume of the sound is not enough for people with, for example, hearing impairments. And again, some users with hearing impairments, they might prefer to receive this information through text and textual information, but there is a lack of customizable choices as well in terms of text size and text presentation. They could potentially help people with hearing impairments. So, but these were the main results in terms of software accessibility. In terms of hardware accessibility, so actually thinking about the actual devices and the equipment that is needed for using VR. In terms of physical accessibility, we found problems related to the actual ergonomics of these headsets, the weight, the comfort, and the controllers as well. This is nothing new. We know the controllers are not usually accessible for people with physical impairments, but there is, again, currently for commercially available headsets, there is a lack of personalized controllers for people with limited motion, but also with physical impairments. In terms of cognitive accessibility, participants who were neurodiverse or had any cognitive impairments, they shared that there is a lack of support and training for learning how to use these headsets. So imagine if you are a user and you are neurodiverse, you want to buy a new headset, you have to learn how to use it. And this can become a accessibility barrier if the instructions are not straightforward, and it's difficult to actually set up the device and adjust your preferences. In terms of visual accessibility, haptics, again, one of my preferred topics. Haptics was a challenge. So haptics, providing the information through touch, it's very, very helpful for people with visual impairments. So you can provide this sensory substitution. However, current haptic hardware might become cumbersome in terms of cost, size, and also comfort. There has been a lot of developments in this field. We have a number of haptic vests that you can wear when you play, when you use VR experiences. Some of these vests are very expensive, and the level of haptic feedback that they provide is limited as well. So this was one of the main topics in terms of visual accessibility. In terms of audio accessibility, one thing that we didn't think before was that a lot of these headsets, VR headsets, they are not accessible and not inclusive for people who are actually wearing hearing aids. So there is a limited physical space to actually wear these headsets if you are, for example, if you use a hearing aid. So this was a problem that was mentioned by some participants in the deaf community, which definitely has to be improved in future technologies. But again, haptics, they can potentially be very helpful for people with hearing impairments. Participants shared concerns around costs and actually the robustness of haptic feedback as well. Finally, so besides software accessibility and also hardware accessibility, we also focused discussions around, collaborating in VR, but also interacting with the virtual worlds. And this is very important because more frequently, people are using VR for collaboration. A lot of schools are using VR apps for educational purposes, but also for training. So thinking about potential accessibility challenges that might arise from collaborating with disabled users in VR is something that should be taken into consideration. In terms of physical accessibility, the need for actually using controllers, as I said before, and using two hands to complete interactions in VR can become a problem. And this was the main challenge shared during these workshops for people with physical impairments. In terms of cognitive challenges, usually in VR, you have to have a very good hand-eye coordination to complete these actions. So for people who cannot rely on hand-eye coordination, this might become an accessibility problem. So, and also around multitasking in VR. These were the two of the main challenges discussed in terms of cognitive abilities. In terms of visual accessibility, people shared that currently, if you use a VR application and you have a visual impairment, there is little description of the environment and awareness of what's going on in the virtual world. So it can become a challenge for people with visual impairments if there's no enough description of what can be done in VR and who is there as well with you in terms of social VR experiences, but also the environment description as well. And this should definitely be improved in future VR technologies. And finally, something that we thought it was a problem before in terms of auditory accessibility. The deaf community shared that VR applications currently don't support sign language interaction, and this should definitely have more focus in future research agenda in this field. Actually, one of my colleagues, Wenga, he's actually working on a project towards making VR more accessible for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So hopefully these would drive more advancements in this field as well. So just to finalize the main result of the Meta Facebook project, we also found other findings that are very important to drive innovation in this field. As I mentioned before, the lack of customizable preferences in terms of accessibility is a huge problem, and this is across all types of impairments and disabilities. All our participants mentioned this as something that should be taken into consideration. So a lot of these VR devices and VR applications, they do provide one or two customizable features, but this is not enough for a lot of people. So the levels of customization should be improved in terms of visual, hearing, cognitive, and physical preferences. And finally, something that was shared across participants was regarding any ethical considerations around the representation and the inclusion of disabled users in virtual reality. A lot of participants were concerned about the potential replication of societal problems in the virtual world. For example, discrimination in the virtual world, especially for social VR experiences, cyberbullying, but also the systematic exclusion of disabled users in current VR applications. And this is definitely something that should be addressed as we move to a much more virtual world. One thing that is very positive currently is that new regulations in terms of accessibility, including the new European Accessibility Act, is that if you provide any services, including virtual services, for example, if you use VR to provide services for your company, you need to make sure that this is accessible for people with disabilities. So hopefully, very soon, people will think about making sure that virtual experiences are also accessible much more. But these were just a summary of these results. There are much more very interesting insights in the paper. But I wanted to finish this session with some of the results of our most recent work around VR accessibility. But before that, I just wanted to share a call to action to everybody working in this field. And one of the results from these workshops, but also all the projects that we have been working on in this area, is that all participants, but also we as researchers, we found that actually it's very important to embed and include disabled users across all stages of VR development. Around concept, design, testing, it's very important to include disabled users and people with a diversity of abilities when you design a new VR technology. And also, we call for a more inclusive number of solutions that actually allow disabled users to actually build their own inclusive solutions. So maybe think about extendable platforms, more general training, open source technologies that disabled users can use to actually design more inclusive solutions in this field. So these are two call to actions for the community that we also discuss in this paper. But before I finish and open for questions, I just wanted to quickly share some results from our paper that was published this month. And the motivation for this research that was led by my PhD student, Craig, was actually to get a better understanding of current locomotion techniques being applied in the industry. So we conducted the first systematic review of locomotion techniques in commercial VR applications. So there has been quite many reviews of locomotion techniques in the academic literature. However, there was no systematic review of locomotion techniques actually being applied in commercial applications that actual real users are using at the moment. So we wanted to actually identify current practices, but also current accessibility issues that should be addressed in the industry. So what we did, we collected data from 330 virtual reality applications released between 2016 and 2023, so last year, on different platforms, Steam, Meta, Oculus, Viveport, and these results were published again in International Journal of Human-Computer Interaction. So in terms of main results and the considerations for accessibility, we found that, for example, the number of applications that use room scale locomotion. So room scale locomotion is when you can actually freely navigate in a real room, and this navigation will be reflected in the virtual world, is actually higher than any other locomotion technique being currently applied in industry. There has been a misconception that actually teleportation is the most used locomotion technique, and this misconception comes from academia, because we researchers we love teleportation. So there has been a lot of research studies focusing on that. But actually, if you look at this graph, you see the number of applications that use teleportation is decreasing every year. The other thing that we found, and you can see here in this graph, is that as time goes, locomotion techniques have become more diverse. So a lot of the current, the VR applications that are being released now, they support multiple locomotion techniques in the same application. This is good in a way, because people have a diversity of locomotion techniques to choose from to navigate virtual environments. But again, this can bring many different accessibility problems. The other interesting finding was that as time goes as well, in terms of hardware use, currently most applications, VR applications, use bimanual controllers, and hand tracking as well. A lot of these VR headsets allow support hands-free interaction, hand tracking through the lip motion device. So this is actually the most used hardware for completing locomotion actions in VR. And the number of applications that support, for example, more customizable input methods, for example, gamepads, keyboards, which actually are very, very frequently used by people with physical impairments, it's decreasing. So this is something that could be a concerning data for the community. So in summary, some other key findings. So the number of locomotion techniques has increased from around four locomotion techniques in one application to 6, suggesting that further research is needed to explore the impact of increasing locomotion complexity in terms of accessibility for people with disabled users. And also, more work is needed to encourage practitioners to implement accessible locomotion alternatives. So one thing that we agreed on is that actually providing more locomotion alternative is not necessarily the best option in terms of accessibility. You also need to make sure that these techniques are accessible and customizable for people with different abilities. And this is the call to action. So this is a current ongoing research, and we plan to release more findings around the current accessibility practices in the industry very soon. But you can find the results of this paper that was published this month that focuses on actually locomotion techniques below. So before I finish my presentation, for people who are watching in person but also online, I just wanted to leave a call to action based on our work. So one of the things that our recent work highlights is the importance of including disabled users across all stages of research, product development, and design and testing. And additionally, I personally think that allowing or creating opportunities for disabled users themselves to design inclusive solutions and open source solutions is also needed to drive innovation in this area. There is a growing makers community in the disabled community, where disabled people get together and design and create inclusive technologies and solutions for them, tailored for their needs. So it's really important that as we grow different VR, XR, immersive technology networks, we promote that as well. So this was a summary of my most recent work in this field around accessible games and virtual inclusive immersive technologies. But if you are interested in hearing more about my work, collaborating or discussing research, I'm always happy to discuss that. So I'll leave my email address, but also my LinkedIn profile if you want to get in touch. And I would like to thank again Ray for inviting me for this seminar. And I'm open for questions if there are any questions. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Arthur. I'm conscious that those of us in the room won't be audible online, I don't think, unless they've got some kind of fancy microphone system going on. So I've just put a little message in the chat saying that anybody's got questions, put them in there. Otherwise, do we have any questions?
What age are you targeting on these games? Usually the participants, your experiments.
Well, that's a good point in terms of age. So for the Suitcase project, especially in Europe, we found that most of our participants were older, and that's because deaf blindness is more common among older people. Usually, people, they are born or blind or deaf, and they become deaf blind later in life. So a lot of our participants in the Suitcase project, people we interviewed, they were older. We did have a number of younger participants, but that was not the most common age group. And there is definitely an interplay around that disability and age. Younger people are much more open to trying new games and technologies. And we saw that older participants were more, skeptical, concerned about, the lack of accessibility. A lot of them said, no, the games are not for me, they are not accessible. So there was definitely a change in attitude, and definitely this has an important role in the way people perceive the inclusiveness of these technologies. But yeah, for the Suitcase project, definitely we interviewed much more older people than younger people. For the Facebook workshops, we did have a number, we have a mix of participants, younger, older, but mostly professional working age. We did invite a lot of people from industry. So yeah, it's definitely, in terms of age, I believe that age has definitely an important role in how people perceive these technologies, but also interact with them. And definitely there's room for more research around not only different understanding how different disabilities affect the accessibility, but also different ages as well. Yeah, no problem. Any questions?
See, Max is typing.
Yeah, I can see that as well.
But I'll just follow that up. So I was interested when you spoke about the Suitcase research. You talked about a number of people had actually given up games.
Yeah.
As a result. Now, presumably, would that include older people who had been playing games, or is this mostly people who were in the younger end, progressive conditions like Usher's, for example?
Yeah, I didn't mention this in the presentation, but we did find very interesting results about that. So some people that we interviewed, because deafblind is such a dynamic, I would say, impairment that changes over time. Some people said, oh, when I was younger, I used to play, Minecraft and other games. But now that I'm older, my impairment progressed. So I cannot rely on residual vision anymore or residual hearing. So I cannot play that game anymore. So there was almost like a nostalgic feeling among these participants. So definitely, how the progressive aspect of deafblindness had an impact on their perceptions as well. I mentioned a little bit about social gaming. A lot of participants actually said, oh, I like playing games because I can play with my daughter or my grandchildren. But as I get older, it becomes more and more difficult for me to play games. So there's again there's definitely room for more research around the interplay of progressive conditions and how this affects the how people perceive accessibility. Thank you. There's a question in the chat. With the current hand tracking systems, such as the lip motion and built-in with the Quest devices, how accurate are they for tracking hand movement for sign language? And are there any systems you know of to live translate sign language into chat bubbles of text? So this is something that I'm very interested in. I think I'm particularly interested in tactile sign language, not visual sign language. But so just to summarize the answer is the current systems are not perfect for sign language translation, live translation. One of the things, so there are two things that are huge problems in terms of hand tracking, especially when you use the lip motion device. One is occlusion. So if you have a lip motion device and you have a hand tracking system, and you are using your hands, if one hand is actually occluding the other, people won't be able to, the system won't be able to recognize sign language. So there are two different ways of occlusion. One is hand on hand. So when one hand is in front of the other, if you are performing a sign language gesture, for example, this won't be possible. The system will not be able to recognize this. So hand on hand occlusion is one of the challenges. In the other type of occlusion is actually occlusion in the system and the environment where your hands are not visible because you are interacting with an object or something else. So currently, the lip motion device is not very accurate for sign language. It is, a lot of people are using for finger spelling, which is one way of sign language, but it's not continuous. So for example, finger spelling is where you spell different letters individually using gestures, and there is quite a few papers exploring the lip motion for that, and with varying results. But we know that in sign language in practice is a much more continuous language where people sign multiple gestures at a time. And currently, the lip motion device is not the most, I would say, the most preferred way to do that. There are other sensors that you can use potentially. People have been doing preliminary work with EMG sensors. And they are not camera-based. The problem with the lip motion device is it is camera-based, so you have to be able to see the hands. The system has to be able to see the hands, but there are other sensors that could potentially recognize different signs. And if you incorporate that into VR, it might be a possibility. But again, this is early stages. There's no a complete study with that, but definitely there are potential routes for exploring different sensors for sign language. But yeah, I don't know if I answered the question, but it's baby steps at the moment. And yeah, the lip motion device is very useful for natural interaction, hands-free interaction, but it wouldn't be the best solution for sign language translation.
I wonder if you can get some sort of exoskeleton-based, often used for haptic gloves, but they're also doing hand tracking at the same time.
Yeah.
I don't know if they would provide a more continuous, more reliable kind of continuous tracking. On the other hand, you might find that the exoskeleton just makes them too bulky to actually sign. Yes,
it is expensive. Yes. Yeah, and the other thing that it is known in the literature is that, again, sign language, there are different deaf communities, and they do sign language differently. The way, for example, if we speak, we have different accents, we have different words across different places. Language is very diverse, and it is also diverse for sign language as well. So one of the challenges, if you are developing such system for sign language translation, is that you have to account for these, particularities across different users. So there's definitely a lot of work in this field. If anyone is interested, I have a few papers that I find very interesting in this area. But again, baby steps in this area. Any other questions? I think we run out our time.
Yeah, I think we are the end. But thank you very much, Arthur, for coming in and sharing your expertise and your experience. So, another round of applause.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming today. Guess we'll sign off there. Everything should be recorded. Faisal is the guy who's looking after that, so I assume I will leave it to him. Oh, sorry, Wenzing Lee's asking for another question. Yes, we do have time for another question.
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely fine. Yeah.
So the question is, which game elements motivate disabled users to continue engaging with AR, VR gaming? Very good question. So the social aspect is definitely something important to consider. There has been a lot of work towards social VR and the metaverse and interacting with other people in the virtual world. So definitely the ability to be social with other people in VR is definitely something that was very welcome across our participants, especially, for example, for disabled users who might otherwise struggle to meet other people in real life. We know that the real world is not very accessible, right? So if you want to go to a restaurant or a cafe and the place is not accessible, and for example, you are a wheelchair user, you won't be able to actually to experience that. VR brings a lot of possibilities to meet people without having to travel. So many of the participants actually mentioned that the social aspect is very important. But again, in terms of social interactions in VR, you have to consider all these, the accessibility as well. One of the aspects that many people discuss in terms of social VR experiences is the representation of their disability, because if you are a disabled user in real life, some of them, their disability might be very visible, right? If you are a wheelchair user, if you use a white cane, or if you have a hearing aid, people can see that maybe you have a disability. A lot of people were concerned about actually in virtual worlds to disclose that information. Do they have to disclose that they have a disability in a virtual world? Should they hide it? How other people will perceive it? So this was definitely something that a lot of people discussed. The implications of representing disability and disabled people in these social aspects in VR. There is, I think, some of these social platforms now, when you create your avatar, you can include some cues that can represent disability and your self-identification. But still, this is a topic of concern for a lot of participants, especially because, as I mentioned, there is a potential for cyberbullying, discrimination, all these negative views that they should be addressed, because as the real world, virtual world should be safe for disabled users. But answering your question, definitely the social aspect of VR experiences was something that motivated people to try these technologies. Hope I answered your question. Yeah, no problem.
Thank you very much, and we will draw things to a close there.
Thank you.